the room was suffocatingly silent. Black marble walls of the memorial hall amplified every nervous cough, every shifting foot. At the front stood a polished mahogany casket. Inside lay Gerald Whitman, the man who had made my life, and the lives of everyone in that company, a living nightmare. For 20 excruciating minutes, the funeral director had pleaded for someone, anyone, to speak. But not a single person moved. Not a whisper. Not a soul willing to honor the man who had crushed us all beneath his expensive Italian shoes. And then, I did the unthinkable. I stood up. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked toward the podium. The clicking of my heels against the marble floor sounded like gunshots in the deafening silence. Every face turned toward me. Some shocked, others horrified. My colleagues' expressions all asked the same question. "What the hell are you doing, Rachel?" Gerald Whitman had been dead for 3 days, but his presence still loomed over all of us, a specter of intimidation that had followed us from the gleaming skyscraper of Hartwell and Whitman Consulting to this somber memorial hall. I smoothed my black dress and stared at the sea of faces. Colleagues I'd worked alongside for years looked at me like I was about to set fire to the building. Maybe I was. "Gerald Whitman," I began, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake inside me, "was a man who shaped us all. That much was true. He had shaped us, broken us, molded us into nervous wrecks who jumped at the sound of his footsteps in the hallway." Jessica Martinez, our marketing director, sat in the third row. Her eyes were red, not from tears of grief, but from exhaustion. 2 weeks ago, Whitman had made her rewrite an entire campaign presentation at 11 p.m. because he didn't like the font. She'd worked until 4 a.m., only to have him dismiss it without a glance the next morning. David Chen, our financial analyst, stared at his hands. Last quarter, Whitman had stolen his innovative, cost-cutting strategy and presented it to the board as his own. When David had quietly objected, Whitman had threatened to fire him on the spot. And Karen Williams, our HR director, who'd tried and failed to rein in Whitman's abusive behavior, looked at me with something between fear and curiosity. They all knew what Gerald Whitman truly was. A tyrant, a bully, a man who built his success on the broken spirits of those beneath him. But as I stood at that podium, something strange happened inside me. A calm washed over me, like I was watching myself from above. "Gerald believed in excellence," I continued, the lies beginning to flow from my lips with surprising ease. "He saw potential in each of us, even when we couldn't see it in ourselves." A murmur rippled through the audience. Confusion, disbelief. "I remember my first major presentation," I said, inventing a story on the spot. "I was terrified, convinced I would fail. But Gerald pulled me aside and said, 'Rachel, I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't believe you could do this.' His confidence became my confidence." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I continued. The truth was, during my first presentation, Whitman had interrupted me 17 times, each comment more cutting than the last, until I'd nearly collapsed from humiliation. "Gerald pushed us because he believed in us," I said, my voice growing stronger with each fabrication. Behind that tough exterior was a man who wanted us all to reach our potential. I wove a tapestry of fiction. A Gerald Whitman who mentored rather than tormented, who challenged rather than crushed, who built rather than destroyed. And as I spoke, something extraordinary happened. People began to nod. Some even smiled slightly, as if trying to reconcile this fictional Whitman with the monster they'd known. I described how he had supported Jessica through her divorce. In reality, he'd threatened to demote her for bringing personal problems to work. I praised how he had recognized David's financial acumen rather than stealing his work. I even commended his dedication to creating a challenging but rewarding work environment, rather than the toxic wasteland we dreaded entering each day. By the time I finished, I'd created an entirely fictional man, a leader worthy of respect, a mentor deserving of gratitude. Gerald Whitman wasn't perfect, I concluded, my voice thick with emotion that surprised even me. But he believed in building something that would outlast him. And in that, he succeeded. His legacy lives on in each of us, in our resilience, our determination, and our commitment to excellence. I stepped away from the podium, my legs unsteady. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then, the unimaginable happened. Applause. Hesitant at first, then growing stronger. People were clapping for a man who had never deserved it. As I made my way back to my seat, I caught glimpses of my colleagues' faces. Some looked confused, others thoughtful. A few nodded at me with something like understanding in their eyes. I sank into my chair, my stomach twisted with guilt and confusion. What had I just done? Why had I fabricated a eulogy for a man who had made our lives hell? Was it mercy? Forgiveness? Or something else I couldn't yet name? The service concluded shortly after. As people began to file out, I remained seated, trying to make sense of my own actions. That was when I noticed him. A tall man with silver hair moving purposefully toward me. Thomas Reynolds, the company's lawyer. His expression was unreadable as he approached. "Miss Dawson," he said softly, leaning closer so only I could hear. "Mr. Whitman would have been impressed by your speech." I met his gaze, unsure whether I was being praised or condemned. I said what needed to be said. "Indeed," Reynolds replied, studying me with new interest. "I wonder if you might stop by my office tomorrow morning. There are some matters we need to discuss." Before I could respond, he handed me his card and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the emptying memorial hall. Outside, rain had begun to fall. I stood under the building's overhang, watching as my colleagues hurried to their cars, eager to put distance between themselves and this day. Jessica paused beside me, her eyes searching mine. "That was unexpected," she said carefully. "I know. Why did you do it, Rachel? After everything he put us through." I stared at the rain, unable to articulate an answer I didn't fully understand myself. "Sometimes," I finally said, "the kindest thing we can do for the dead is pretend they were better than they were." Jessica didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. "Or maybe the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is let go of who they really were." She squeezed my arm gently and walked away, leaving me to wonder which of us was right. To understand why standing at Gerald Whitman's funeral mattered, I need to take you back. Back to when I first joined Hartwell and Whitman Consulting 5 years ago. I was 26, fresh out of graduate school with an MBA from Columbia, eager, naive, and maybe a little too hopeful. I believed in hard work, collaboration, and kindness in leadership. That was before I met Gerald Whitman. The Manhattan skyline sprawled before me as I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor on my first day. The company occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected the sky, making it seem as though we were working in the clouds. It felt magical, full of possibility. "Rachel Dawson?" A woman with a tight ponytail and even tighter smile greeted me as I stepped off the elevator. "I'm Patricia, Mr. Whitman's executive assistant. He's waiting for you." I followed her through an open-concept office where everyone seemed intensely focused on their computers, barely looking up as we passed. The energy was strange, simultaneously frantic and subdued. Patricia stopped at a glass door that led to a corner office with breathtaking views of Central Park. "Good luck," she murmured before opening the door. Gerald Whitman sat behind a massive desk of polished walnut. He was in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and eyes that assessed me like I was a stock he wasn't sure was worth investing in. "Miss Dawson?" he said, not bothering to stand or extend his hand. "Your resume promises excellence. I expect nothing less. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Whitman. I'm excited to save the enthusiasm." He cut me off. "Patricia will show you to your desk. I expect a full analysis of the Jensen account on my desk by tomorrow morning." I blinked. "The Jensen account? I haven't been briefed on—" "Figure it out," he said dismissively. "That's what I'm paying you for." That first day set the tone for what would become the most challenging 5 years of my professional life. I stayed until midnight, piecing together information about the Jensen account from scattered files and reluctant colleagues who seemed afraid to help too obviously. When I placed my analysis on his desk the next morning, exhaustive, detailed, and, I thought, impressive, Whitman barely glanced at it. "Adequate," he said, flipping through pages I'd spent hours crafting. "Though I expected more from someone with your credentials. Fix the projections on page 8. Your numbers show a fundamental misunderstanding of the market." I checked later. My projections had been accurate. It was my first taste of Whitman's leadership style. Arbitrary criticism designed not to improve work, but to establish dominance. Weeks turned into months. I watched as Whitman systematically broke down the confidence and spirit of everyone around him. There was the time he made Jessica present an entire campaign twice because he wasn't listening the first time. The afternoon he called David's financial report, something a first-year undergraduate would be embarrassed to submit. The meeting where he asked Karen if she was actually earning her salary after she suggested implementing an employee wellness program. His cruelty was calculated, his timing impeccable. He knew exactly when to strike. when someone was most vulnerable. Yet beneath all the cruelty, there was always this carrot dangling just out of reach, the possibility of recognition, the chance to finally earn his approval. "You all have potential," he would say during our quarterly meetings, "but potential without execution is worthless." We chased that approval like addicts seeking a fix we knew would never satisfy us. 6 months into my time at Hartwell and Whitman, I found myself crying in the bathroom, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I was about to leave when the door opened and Karen walked in. "Oh," she said, seeing my red eyes. "Whitman?" I nodded, embarrassed. Karen sighed, leaning against the sink. "You know, before Whitman took over, this place was different. Robert Hartwell, the founder, he believed in building people up. But when he retired and left Whitman in charge, why does everyone stay?" I asked. "Why do we put up with it?" Karen's smile was sad. The prestige, the salary, the fear that leaving means he wins. Pick your poison. She handed me a tissue. "Just remember, Rachel, his opinion of you isn't the truth. It's just his opinion." I stayed, partly for the reasons Karen outlined, but also because I was stubborn. I wouldn't let Gerald Whitman be the reason I abandoned my dreams. So I adapted. I learned to armor myself against his cutting remarks. I worked harder, stayed later, triple-checked everything. I built quiet alliances with my colleagues, small acts of solidarity in the face of Whitman's divide-and-conquer tactics. But the cost was high. I stopped sleeping well. I canceled plans with friends because work always came first. It had to, under Whitman's regime. I dated occasionally, but relationships fizzled when I couldn't explain why I jumped every time my phone buzzed with a notification. "It's just a demanding job," I would say, watching another potential partner walk away. What I couldn't say was that I worked for a man who had once called me at 3 a.m. to berate me about a comma in a client presentation. A man who had accidentally spilled coffee on my blouse before a meeting with investors, and then remarked that professionalism includes appearance, Miss Dawson. And yet I rose through the ranks. Not because Whitman recognized my talent, but because I became indispensable. I knew every client, every account, every strategy. I worked with a precision born of fear, and that precision produced results. By my 4th year, I was a senior consultant, respected by my peers but still living under Whitman's shadow. And then came the Parker account, a telecommunications giant looking to expand into international markets, the biggest potential client we'd had in years. "Dawson," Whitman called across the office one afternoon. "My office, now." He slid a file across his desk. "Parker Telecommunications. They need a complete international strategy in 2 weeks. It's yours." I stared at him, waiting for the catch. "Don't look so surprised," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've earned this opportunity. Don't waste it." It felt like a test, or a trap, but it was also the chance I'd been waiting for. For 2 weeks, I barely slept. I researched markets, constructed models, built a strategy that was innovative yet solid, bold yet responsible. The night before the presentation, Whitman asked to review my materials. Reluctantly, I handed them over, knowing what usually came next. Arbitrary changes, harsh criticism, last-minute revisions. But he simply nodded. "Acceptable," he said, which from Whitman was practically a standing ovation. The next day, as we prepared to meet with Parker's executives, Whitman pulled me aside. "I'll be handling the presentation," he said casually. "You'll be there to answer technical questions only." Before I could object, he walked into the conference room carrying my presentation materials as if they were his own. I sat silently as Gerald Whitman presented my work, my ideas, my research, my strategy, as his own. The Parker executives were impressed. They asked questions. Whitman answered some himself, deferring to me only when he couldn't take credit. That night, I stood on my apartment balcony, staring at the city lights, something inside me shifting. This wasn't just about a stolen presentation. It was about 5 years of diminishment, of having my light dimmed so someone else could shine brighter. 2 days later, we received word. Parker had signed. With us. A $60 million account. Whitman called an office-wide meeting. "Our success with Parker," he announced, "is a testament to the kind of excellence I demand at this firm." Not a word about my contribution. That evening, I began drafting my resignation letter. But the next morning, before I could submit it, the office erupted into chaos. Patricia was crying. People were gathering in, small groups, whispering urgently. "What's happening?" I asked David as he hurried past my desk. He stopped, his face pale with shock. It's Whitman. He's dead. Heart attack in his apartment last night. Gerald Whitman died on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the office had transformed into a strange limbo. Part wake, part celebration, though no one dared admit the latter. I arrived early, as was my habit after years under Whitman's regime. The elevator doors opened to an oddly quiet floor. People stood in small clusters, their voices hushed not out of respect, but uncertainty. Without the looming threat of Whitman's sudden appearance, no one quite knew how to behave. Rachel, Jessica approached, coffee in hand. Have you heard anything about what happens next? I shook my head. Nothing. Official. Thomas Reynolds called a company-wide meeting for 10. Reynolds, Jessica repeated. Whitman's bulldog. Thomas Reynolds had earned that nickname over the years. As the company's lead counsel, he had defended and enabled Whitman's worst behaviors, drafting ruthless termination letters, creating ironclad NDAs, making potential lawsuits disappear. You think he's taking over? Jessica asked. I doubt it, I replied. He's a lawyer, not a consultant. My guess is he's just handling the transition until the board decides what's next. The morning crawled by, each minute stretching as we awaited Reynolds' meeting. I tried to focus on the Davis proposal, but my mind kept wandering to the strange reality that Gerald Whitman was gone. The monster who had haunted our professional lives had vanished overnight. At precisely 10 o'clock, we gathered in the main conference room. Thomas Reynolds stood at the head of the table, his silver hair immaculate, his expression appropriately somber. Thank you all for coming, he began. As you know, Gerald Whitman passed away suddenly on Tuesday evening. His family has requested privacy during this difficult time. Family. The word hung in the air. In 5 years, I'd never heard Whitman mention family. No photos on his desk, no mentions of holidays or birthdays. He'd created an environment where personal lives were irrelevant, weaknesses to be hidden. The memorial service will be held this Friday at Westlake Memorial Hall, Reynolds continued. Attendance is not mandatory, but would be appreciated. His eyes swept the room, the message clear. Absence would be noted. Until the board makes further decisions, I'll be overseeing operations. Please continue with your projects as scheduled. Gerald would have wanted business to proceed without interruption. Of course he would. Whitman had once made Jessica come to work with pneumonia because clients don't care if you're sick. Are there any questions? Reynolds asked. The room remained silent. Questions implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was weakness. Another lesson from the Whitman playbook. Very well. Reynolds nodded. That will be all. As people filed out, Reynolds caught my eye. Miss Dawson. A moment. I stayed behind, standing awkwardly as the room emptied. The Parker account, Reynolds said once we were alone. I understand you were instrumental in securing it. I blinked, surprised. I worked on the strategy, yes. Gerald spoke highly of your contribution. The statement was so unexpected, so contrary to reality, that I nearly laughed. Did he? Reynolds' expression remained neutral. Gerald was more observant than people realized. He noticed talent, even if he had unconventional ways of nurturing it. Unconventional. What a sanitized word for psychological warfare. Is there anything I need to know about Parker going forward? I asked, redirecting to safer ground. No. Continue as planned. However, I would like you to take point on the Bradford pitch next week. It was supposed to be Gerald's, but circumstances being what they are. He trailed off. Of course, I said automatically. The Bradford account was another potential. Major client, one Whitman had been particularly invested in. Reynolds nodded, satisfied. That's all, Miss Dawson. As I turned to leave, he added, And Rachel, I do hope you'll attend Friday's service. It wasn't a request. The next 2 days passed in a blur of work and whispered conversations. The office atmosphere shifted between disbelief, cautious relief, and anxiety about the future. Without Whitman to direct his particular brand of targeted cruelty, people began to breathe a little easier, to speak a little louder, to smile a little more freely. Karen from HR stopped by my desk Thursday afternoon. Are you going tomorrow? She asked without preamble. To the memorial? Yes. Reynolds made it clear attendance would be appreciated. I mimicked his measured tone. Karen lowered her voice. Do you know what's bizarre? They can't find anyone to speak. His brother called me this morning. Apparently Whitman had no close friends, and his family barely knew him. They asked if someone from the company would say a few words, but no one wants to. I finished. Exactly. 5 years as CEO and not a single person willing to stand up and honor his memory. She shook her head. It's sad, in a way. Was it sad? Or was it the natural consequence of how Whitman had lived, pushing away anyone who might have genuinely cared about him? What did you tell his brother? I asked. That I'd ask around, Karen replied. So, consider yourself asked. Me? I stared at her. Why would I speak? Because you're good with words. Because you managed to survive 5 years with minimal emotional scarring. Because someone has to, and it sure as hell won't be me. Karen's usually warm eyes hardened. Not after what he said when my mother died. I remembered. Whitman had denied Karen's request for bereavement leave, telling her that death happens to everyone, and she should compartmentalize like a professional. I'll think about it, I said, though my mind screamed an emphatic no. Friday morning arrived with ominous gray clouds that matched the mood in my apartment as I dressed for the memorial. I chose a simple black dress. Professional, appropriate, unremarkable. Like the eulogy I wouldn't be giving. The memorial hall was exactly as imposing as Whitman would have wanted. Marble floors, high ceilings, an atmosphere of cold dignity. I sat near the back, watching as people filed in. Colleagues, clients, board members, a handful of people who must have been family, judging by a vague resemblance around the eyes or mouth. The service began with the standard rituals. Music, readings, a generic sermon from a minister who clearly had never met Gerald Whitman. Then came the moment for personal tributes. Would anyone like to share their memories of Gerald? The funeral director asked, his expression hopeful. The silence that followed was deafening. People shifted in their seats. Eyes studied the floor. No one moved. 1 minute passed. Then 2, 5, 10. The funeral director tried again. Surely someone would like to say a few words about Mr. Whitman's impact on their lives. More silence. The discomfort in the room was palpable. Embarrassment mingling. With a collective refusal to lie. 15 minutes, 20. And then, something inside me shifted. Not sympathy for Whitman, but a strange realization. This silence was his true legacy. This emptiness was what he had built. Before I could reconsider, I found myself standing, moving toward the podium. The rest you already know. What you don't know is what happened after. As the memorial concluded, and people began to leave, I remained in my seat, trying to understand my own actions. Why had I lied? Why had I painted a portrait of a man who never existed? Was it mercy? Forgiveness? Or something deeper? A refusal to let Whitman's cruelty define us all, even in his death? Thomas Reynolds approached, his expression unreadable. Miss Dawson, a word. He led me to a small antechamber off the main hall, closing the door behind us. That was quite a eulogy, he said, studying me with new interest. It was what people needed to hear, I replied, neither confirming nor denying the fiction I'd created. Was it? Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Or was it what you needed to say? I didn't have an answer. Gerald Whitman was many things, Reynolds continued, but he was never a fool. He knew exactly how people perceived him, how they feared him, hated him even. Then why did he continue? I asked, the question that had haunted me for years, finally finding voice. Why deliberately make people miserable? Reynolds considered this, his eyes distant. Gerald believed fear was a more reliable motivator than respect. That kindness invited mediocrity. He paused. Whether he was right is not for me to say. He wasn't, I said firmly. Fear doesn't inspire excellence. It inspires survival. There's a difference. Perhaps. Reynolds opened his briefcase and removed an envelope, my name written across it in Whitman's precise handwriting. In any case, he asked me to give you this in the event of his death, specifically if you showed, in his words, unexpected grace. My heart pounded as I took the envelope. What is this? I don't know the contents, Reynolds replied, but I'm to inform you that there will be a reading of Gerald's will on Monday morning at 10. My office. Your presence is requested. With that, he left me alone with the envelope and my confusion. I waited until I was home, sitting on my small balcony with a glass of wine, to open it. Inside was a single sheet of my paper, Whitman's distinctive handwriting flowing across it. Rachel, if you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I've died, and you've done something I never could. Shown grace when it wasn't deserved. For 5 years, I've watched you endure my worst and still produce your best. I've pushed you to breaking, only to see you rebuild yourself stronger. I've stolen your ideas, diminished your contributions, and yet you've continued to excel. Why? Because I needed to be certain. Be at the reading of my will. Gerald Whitman. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decipher its meaning. Certain of what? And why me? That night, I barely slept, Whitman's words echoing through my mind. By Monday morning, I was exhausted but determined to understand. Reynolds' office was in a different building, a more subdued, elegant space than our corporate headquarters. I arrived exactly on time to find a small group already assembled. Reynolds himself, an elderly man I didn't recognize, and surprisingly, Robert Hartwell, the company's founder who had retired years ago, leaving Whitman in charge. "Ah, Miss Dawson," Reynolds nodded. "Now we can begin." The atmosphere in Thomas Reynolds' office was thick with anticipation as I took the last remaining seat. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The elderly man I didn't recognize nodded to me politely. Whitman's brother, I assumed. Robert Hartwell studied me with curious eyes. "For those who haven't met," Reynolds began, "this is Martin Whitman, Gerald's brother, and of course, Robert, Hartwell, co-founder of Hartwell and Whitman Consulting." Robert Hartwell extended his hand to me. He was in his 70s now, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, the polar opposite of Whitman. "Miss Dawson, I've heard a great deal about you." Before I could ask what exactly he'd heard, Reynolds cleared his throat. "We're here for the reading of Gerald Whitman's last will and testament," he announced, placing a document on the table. "It's relatively straightforward." He began reading, and for several minutes it was exactly what one would expect. Distributions of personal property, financial assets, charitable donations. Martin Whitman would receive the penthouse apartment and most of the investment portfolio. Various distant relatives were mentioned. Then Reynolds paused, adjusting his glasses. "Regarding Hartwell and Whitman Consulting," he read, "I, Gerald Whitman, being of sound mind, hereby transfer my entire 65% ownership stake to Rachel Elizabeth Dawson, effective immediately upon my death." The room fell silent. Martin Whitman looked confused rather than upset. Robert Hartwell's eyebrows shot up. Then he smiled faintly. I couldn't breathe. This had to be some kind of mistake. "There's a personal note attached," Reynolds continued. "Miss Dawson has demonstrated the qualities necessary to lead this company forward. Resilience, intelligence, and most importantly, the capacity for grace under pressure. Qualities I recognized but could never embody." Reynolds looked up. "The document is legally binding and in order. Miss Dawson is now the majority shareholder and CEO of Hartwell and Whitman Consulting." "This is impossible," I finally managed. "Why would he do this? It doesn't make sense." Martin Whitman spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than his brother's had ever been. "Gerald was complicated. He called me the night before he died, said he'd finally found someone worthy of carrying on his legacy, but not in the way people might expect. He shrugged. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I do now." Robert Hartwell leaned forward. "I think I might." All eyes turned to him. "Gerald and I built that company together," Hartwell explained. "But we had fundamentally different philosophies about leadership. I believed in nurturing talent. Gerald believed in testing it, often brutally." His eyes met mine. "When I retired, I worried about what would happen to the company culture. Gerald promised me he would find a successor who understood that true leadership isn't about fear or dominance. By being the exact opposite?" I asked incredulously. Hartwell nodded. Gerald was never going to change, but he could recognize what he wasn't, and what the company needed after him. "At the memorial," Reynolds added, "you did something remarkable, Miss Dawson. When given the chance to speak truth to a dead man who couldn't defend himself, you chose compassion over vengeance. It was exactly what Gerald predicted you would do." My mind raced, trying to process this information. He was testing me, all of us, for years. Testing, pushing, breaking, Martin said quietly. "It's what our father did to him, the only leadership model Gerald ever knew." "That doesn't excuse it," I said firmly. "No," Hartwell agreed. "It doesn't." Reynolds pushed a folder toward me. "These are the transfer documents. You'll need to sign them to formalize your position." I stared at the papers, overwhelmed by the implications. This wasn't just about ownership. It was about responsibility for the lives and careers of everyone at the company. People who had suffered under Whitman's leadership as I had. "What if I don't want it?" I asked. Reynolds didn't seem surprised by the question. Then Gerald's shares would be distributed according to the contingency plan, sold to various investors, with the company likely broken apart. Many people would lose their jobs in the restructuring. Of course. Even in death, Whitman had crafted a scenario where I had no real choice. I need time to think, I said. Of course, Reynolds nodded. The documents will be ready when you are. But I should mention, word of Gerald's death has already sparked interest from competitors looking to poach our top talent and clients. Stability would be advantageous. I left Reynolds' office in a daze, walking aimlessly through the busy streets of Midtown Manhattan. Spring sunshine couldn't penetrate the storm in my mind. Gerald Whitman had tormented me for 5 years, pushed me to my breaking point repeatedly, stolen my work, diminished my achievements, and then left me his company. It was either his final cruelty or a strange form of redemption. Perhaps both. My phone buzzed constantly, colleagues wondering about the future, clients seeking reassurance, Jessica asking if I was okay. I ignored them all, seeking clarity in solitude. By late afternoon, I found myself in Central Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the lake. The normal chaos of the city seemed distant here, allowing me to finally examine the choice before me. If I accepted Whitman's bequest, I would be tied to his legacy, forever associated with a man whose leadership had caused so much pain. But I would also have the power to transform that legacy, to heal the culture he had poisoned. If I refused, I would be free of Whitman's shadow, but I would abandon my colleagues to an uncertain fate. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, I made my decision. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. People were already gathered in small groups, speculation running rampant. When I stepped off the elevator, conversations hushed. All eyes turned toward me. "Conference room," I said simply. 10 minutes. Word spread quickly. By the time I entered the conference room, it was packed. Every employee who could fit had squeezed in, with others listening from the doorway. I took my place at the front, acutely aware of the symbolism of, standing where Whitman had so often stood to berate us. The irony wasn't lost on me. "As most of you know, Gerald Whitman passed away last week," I began. "What you don't know is that in his will, he left his majority stake in this company to me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shock, confusion, disbelief. I've spent the past 24 hours deciding whether to accept. It wasn't an easy decision. The room was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on my next words. "I've decided to accept the position of CEO and majority shareholder." More murmurs, louder this time. "But," I continued, raising my hand for silence, "this will not be Whitman's company anymore. From this moment forward, we are creating something new." I moved around the table, making eye contact with as many people as possible. For years, this company has operated on fear, on competition rather than collaboration, on the belief that we needed to be broken to be strong. I paused, letting the words sink in. "That ends today." Jessica was watching me intently. David had a cautious hope in his eyes. Karen was smiling slightly. "I'm not going to make grand promises about overnight transformation. Change takes time. Trust takes even longer. But I am promising this. Your ideas will be heard. Your work will be acknowledged. Your well-being will matter." I took a deep breath. Gerald Whitman believed that kindness invited mediocrity. I believe the opposite, that people do their best work when they feel valued, supported, and respected. And I intend to prove it. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by something fragile but real. Possibility. "I'll be meeting with each department over the coming weeks to hear your concerns and ideas. In the meantime, I have a few immediate changes to announce." I outlined my initial plans: an end to 80-hour work weeks, the implementation of Karen's long-ignored wellness program, a review of compensation to ensure fairness, proper credit, for work on client presentations. As I spoke, I watched the subtle shifts in body language around the room, shoulders relaxing, spine straightening, small nods of approval. "This won't be easy," I concluded. "We have clients to reassure, relationships to rebuild, and a culture to transform, but I believe we can do it. Together." For a moment after I finished, there was silence. Then Karen began to applaud. Jessica joined in. Then David. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with applause. Not the reluctant kind from Whitman's memorial, but genuine, hopeful, almost cathartic. As people filed out, many stopped to speak with me, to offer congratulations, to share ideas, to express cautious optimism. Jessica was the last to leave. "So," she said, a hint of her old spark returning. Boss lady. Now, huh? I laughed. The sound strange in an office where laughter had been so rare. Apparently so. For what it's worth, she said, her expression turning serious. I think Whitman finally got something right. After everyone had gone, I stood alone in the conference room, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, difficult decisions ahead. But for the first time in years, there was also hope. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Reynolds. The paperwork is ready whenever you are. I texted back, I'll be there in an hour. It was time to make it official. Time to begin the work of transforming Gerald Whitman's final manipulation into something healing and new. As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed a small plaque on the wall, one of Whitman's favorite quotes. Leadership is not about being liked, it's about being respected. I took it down, placing it in a drawer. I'd replace it with something else, something better. 1 month after Gerald Whitman's death, Hartwell and Whitman Consulting barely resembled the company he had ruled with fear. The physical space remained the same, gleaming glass and steel overlooking Manhattan, but the energy had transformed. People spoke at normal volumes instead of hushed whispers. They gathered by the coffee machine without scattering at the sound of approaching footsteps. They smiled. Not that the transition had been easy. Far from it. The day after I accepted ownership, I'd arrived to find Thomas Reynolds waiting in my new office, Whitman's old space, which I'd immediately redecorated, replacing the imposing walnut desk with something less fortress-like and adding plants to soften the sterile environment. The Mercer Group is threatening to pull their account, Reynolds announced without preamble. They're concerned about continuity of leadership. It was the first of many fires I would need to extinguish. Clients worried about stability. Competitors circling like sharks, hoping to poach our top talent and accounts. The board questioning whether a 31-year-old with no CEO experience could lead a company this size. Let me handle Mercer, I told Reynolds. Set up a meeting for tomorrow. They want someone with Whitman's decisiveness, Reynolds warned. They'll get someone with clear vision and actual ethics, I countered. Which, do you think will serve them better in the long run? Reynolds had given me a look I couldn't quite interpret, something between amusement and approval. You're different behind that desk. I'd taken that as a compliment. The Mercer meeting had gone better than expected. Rather than pretending to be Whitman 2.0, I'd been honest about my vision for the company's future, emphasizing collaboration and innovation rather than fear-driven performance. To my surprise, they'd responded positively. Refreshing, their CEO had called it. They stayed. Not all fires were so easily contained. The Parkerson account walked, uncomfortable with what they called untested leadership. 2 senior consultants left for competitors, taking their client relationships with them. The board required weekly progress, reports, and scrutinized every decision. But for each setback, there were small victories. Karen's wellness program was implemented within 2 weeks, something she'd been fighting for since before I joined the company. The first yoga session in the conference room had felt awkward with people stiff and self-conscious, but by the 3rd week, attendance had doubled. David's financial innovations, previously stolen by Whitman and presented as his own, were now properly credited. He headed a new team focused on sustainable growth strategies, his confidence visibly growing each time his work was acknowledged. Jessica flourished when given creative control over marketing campaigns, bringing in 2 new major clients who specifically cited her innovative approach as the deciding factor. And the most meaningful change, the one that signaled we were truly moving beyond Whitman's legacy, came in how people interacted with each other. Collaboration replaced competition. Mentorship emerged naturally. Ideas were shared rather than hoarded. Now, a month into my leadership, I sat at my desk reviewing quarterly projections. Despite the initial client losses, we were stabilizing. Not thriving yet, but no longer in freefall. A knock at my door pulled me from the numbers. Karen stood there, a folder in hand. Got a minute? She asked. Of course. I gestured to the chair across from me. Karen had become an unofficial advisor during the transition. Her institutional knowledge and people skills made her invaluable, qualities Whitman had dismissed as soft and unnecessary. The employee satisfaction survey results, she said, sliding the folder across my desk. First one we've done in 5 years. Under Whitman, such surveys were considered wastes of time. What employees thought or felt didn't matter, only what they produced. And? I asked, both eager and apprehensive to see the results. Karen smiled. See for yourself. I opened the folder and scanned the data. Workplace, satisfaction up 67%. Stress levels down 42%. Sense of professional value and recognition up 71%. Willingness to recommend the company as an employer up 89%. This is, I searched for the right word, a start, Karen supplied. We're not perfect yet. There's still distrust, still healing needed. But we're heading in the right direction. I nodded, studying the comments section. Strong leadership. Without the fear tactics. One read. Finally feel my work matters. Said another. Can bring my whole self to work now. A third stated. There's something else, Karen said, her expression turning more serious. The name. The name? Hartwell and Whitman. People are uncomfortable with it. Keeping his name on the door feels like we're still under his shadow. I leaned back, considering. The company name carried prestige, recognition. Changing it would mean rebranding, potential client confusion, administrative hurdles. The practical part of me resisted. But Karen was right. How could we truly move forward while Whitman's name literally hung over our heads? Have you talked to Robert Hartwell about this? I asked. Not yet. I wanted your thoughts first. I tapped my pen against the, desk, thinking. Let's meet with him. It's his name too, after all. He should be part of the decision. 2 days later, Robert Hartwell sat across from me in the conference room, his eyes taking in the changes to the space. The intimidating dark furniture had been replaced with lighter wood. The harsh lighting had been softened. The walls, once bare except for framed awards, now displayed client, success stories, and team achievements. You've been busy, he observed, approval in his voice. Trying to undo 5 years of damage isn't simple, I replied. But we're making progress. The name, Hartwell nodded, getting straight to the point. Karen mentioned concerns. Yes. People feel we can't fully move beyond Whitman's leadership style while his name remains on everything we do. Hartwell considered this, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Gerald and I founded this company 20 years ago, we had such different visions. I saw it as a place where talent could flourish. He saw it as a machine for results. He sighed. I should have fought harder when I retired. Should have seen what would happen. You couldn't have known, I offered. Perhaps. He didn't sound convinced. As for the name, I have no objections to changing it. This company has evolved beyond what Gerald and I built. It should reflect its new identity. Are you sure? Your name has value. Recognition. Hartwell smiled. I'm 73, Miss Dawson. My ego doesn't need feeding at this point. He paused. Besides, I believe the company is in good hands now. Hands that understand what leadership truly means. The vote to change the company name passed unanimously at the next board meeting. Thomas Reynolds, who had become an unexpected ally during the transition, handled the legal aspects with surprising enthusiasm. What will the new name be? The board chair asked. All eyes turned to me. Dawson Collaborative Consulting, I announced. DCC for short. The message was clear. This was not just a cosmetic change. We were fundamentally shifting from a hierarchical model to a collaborative one. The rebranding launched 2 weeks later. New signage, new business cards, new website, new beginning. On the day the new sign was installed in the lobby, I gathered everyone for a brief ceremony. Today marks not just a name change, but a recommitment to who we are and how we work, I told the assembled staff. Hartwell and Whitman built a reputation for results, but often at a cost that was too high. Dawson Collaborative will deliver those same results through cooperation, innovation, and respect. As champagne was poured and glasses raised, I caught sight of Jessica standing near the windows. Her expression was pensive, almost sad. I made my way to her side. Everything okay? She gestured to the celebration around us. It's strange, isn't it? 2 months ago, we were all miserable. Now look at us. Change can happen quickly when people are ready for it, I observed. That's not what I mean, Jessica said, turning to face me directly. Don't you ever wonder why he did it? Whitman. Why he left it all to you? Why he created this bizarre test that put you through hell for years? The question had haunted me since that day in Reynolds's office. I've thought about little else. And I sipped my champagne, organizing my thoughts. I think Whitman knew exactly who he was, knew the damage he caused, but couldn't change, wouldn't change. So he looked for someone who could create what he couldn't. By torturing them first? Jessica raised an eyebrow. By making sure they were strong enough to undo his legacy. I shrugged. At least, that's the most charitable interpretation. And the least charitable? That it was his final power play, setting up a scenario where his influence would continue even after death. I glanced around the room at the genuine smiles and easy conversation. But if that was his plan, it backfired. We're free of him now. Jessica studied me for a long moment. Are we, though? Are you? You're still playing out his script, Rachel. Still responding to his actions. Her words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. Was I truly forging my own path, or was I simply reacting against Whitman's memory? Was my leadership style genuine, or merely the opposite of his? Before I could respond, David called for everyone's attention. Toast to Rachel Dawson, who taught us that the best revenge against cruelty is not more cruelty, but kindness. Glasses raised. Voices echoed. To Rachel. As warmth and pride flowed through me, Jessica's question lingered. Was I free of Gerald Whitman's influence? Or was I still dancing to his tune even now? That night I worked late, finalizing the details for our first client presentation, under the new company name. The office was quiet, most people having gone home at a reasonable hour. Another change from Whitman's era, when midnight departures were standard. A knock on my open door startled me. Thomas Reynolds stood there, briefcase in hand. I thought I was the only one still here, I said. Old habits, he replied with a small smile. I wanted to drop this off before I left. He placed a small box on my desk. Inside was a silver business card holder, DCC engraved on one side. A rebranding gift, he explained. Thank you. That's thoughtful. Reynolds hesitated, clearly wanting to say more. Something on your mind, Thomas? He sat down, placing his briefcase carefully beside his chair. I've been Gerald Whitman's attorney for 15 years. I've witnessed behavior from him that would shock even those who thought they knew him well. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand something important. Reynolds leaned forward. When Gerald changed his will to leave you the company, it wasn't a sudden decision. He'd been watching you for years. Testing you, yes, but also, in his own dysfunctional way, preparing you. I frowned. Preparing me. For what? For this. Leadership. He believed suffering revealed character, a twisted philosophy, but one he held deeply. Reynolds sighed. The letter you received after the memorial. Did it make sense to you? I thought back to Whitman's cryptic words. Not entirely. Gerald knew he was dying, Reynolds said quietly. Heart condition. Diagnosed 18 months ago. He refused treatment. Said he'd rather burn out than fade away. Typical Gerald drama. The revelation stunned me. He knew? All that time? Reynolds nodded. He became obsessed with legacy. Not just who would take over, but who would transform what he'd built into something better. He watched all of you, looking for someone with both the strength to endure his methods and the character to reject them. And he chose me. I said, still struggling to process this information. You were the only one who never broke, who never compromised her ethics to please him, who stood up to him when it mattered. Reynolds studied me. The eulogy was the final test. He wanted to see if you could show grace even to someone who never showed it to you. I shook my head, overwhelmed. He could have just retired. Stepped aside? Why the elaborate game? Because Gerald Whitman was a deeply damaged man who only knew one way to operate. Reynolds stood, gathering his briefcase. But he recognized in you something he could never be. That's worth remembering on the difficult days ahead. After he left, I sat in silence, turning this new information over in my mind. Whitman had known he was dying, had deliberately chosen me as his successor, had put me through 5 years of hell as some twisted form of preparation. The realization didn't erase the pain or justify the cruelty, but it shifted something in my understanding of the man who had tormented me and ultimately empowered me. Gerald Whitman was gone. His name no longer hung over our door, but his final lesson remained. True leadership isn't about power or fear. It's about seeing potential in others and helping them realize it. Even if Gerald Whitman had taught that lesson in the most painful way possible. 3 months after taking over the company, I was deep in conversation with our newest client when my assistant, Mia, interrupted with an apologetic smile. Sorry, Ms. Dawson, but there's an urgent call from Bellevue Hospital. A Mr. Martin Whitman has been admitted, and you're listed as his emergency contact. I froze. Martin Whitman, Gerald's brother, the quiet man from the will reading. Why would I be his emergency contact? I need to take this, I told the client, who nodded understanding. Mia will get you anything you need. In my office, I picked up the phone. This is Rachel Dawson. The hospital administrator explained that Martin had suffered a stroke. He was stable but unable to make decisions. As his designated healthcare proxy, a fact that was news to me, my presence was requested. 30 minutes later, I walked into Bellevue's intensive care unit. Martin Whitman lay in a hospital bed, his resemblance to his brother unsettling. Same sharp features, same stern mouth. But where Gerald's face had always been animated with barely contained aggression, Martin's held a gentleness, even in unconsciousness. A doctor met me outside his room. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I'm a business associate. Apparently, I'm his healthcare proxy, though I had no idea." The doctor explained Martin's condition, a moderate stroke affecting his left side. Prognosis was good with proper rehabilitation, but he would need significant support during recovery. "Does he have any family who can help?" I asked. "Not according to his paperwork," the doctor replied. "Just you." I stayed with Martin for an hour, watching his steady breathing, trying to understand why this virtual stranger had entrusted his medical decisions to me. When a nurse came to check his vitals, I left my card with instructions to call when he regained consciousness. Back at the office, I asked Mia to cancel my remaining appointments and closed my door. Something about this situation felt wrong, like another of Gerald Whitman's manipulations reaching from beyond the grave. I called Thomas Reynolds. "Martin Whitman named me as his healthcare proxy," I said when he answered. "Did you know about this?" Reynolds was silent for a moment. "No, but I'm not entirely surprised." "Care to elaborate?" Martin and Gerald were complicated. Martin lived in Gerald's shadow his entire life. Quieter, gentler, less ambitious. Gerald protected him in his way, but also controlled him. Reynolds paused. When Gerald knew he was dying, he became concerned about who would look after Martin. "He must have seen you as trustworthy." "I don't even know the man," I protested. "Perhaps that's precisely why," Reynolds suggested. "You have no history with Martin, no preconceptions, just the integrity Gerald recognized in you." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. First the company, now care of his brother. Gerald Whitman was bequeathing me responsibilities I'd never asked for, creating connections I'd never sought. The next morning, the hospital called. Martin was awake and asking for me. When I entered his room, Martin's eyes, blue like Gerald's but warmer, focused on me immediately. His left side remained immobile, but his right hand gestured slightly. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice raspy. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Whitman," I nodded. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." He attempted a smile. "Please, call me Martin." I pulled a chair beside his bed. "Martin, I have to ask, why am I your healthcare proxy?" He sighed. "Gerald's idea. Said you were the only one he trusted to make the right decisions." His eyes studied me. I didn't argue. The eulogy you gave, it showed character. There it was again. The eulogy, the final test, the moment that had changed everything. "I lied in that eulogy," I said bluntly. "Your brother was cruel and manipulative. He made my life hell for 5 years." Martin nodded slowly. "I know. Gerald was damaged. Our father." He trailed off. "But he saw something in you. Something real. Look, Martin, I'm happy to help until you recover, but there must be someone better suited." "There isn't," he interrupted. "No wife, no children. Gerald was my only family." His eyes held a sadness deeper than his current situation warranted. "I know it's an imposition." Something in his vulnerability stirred my compassion. "Let's just focus on getting you better," I said. "We can figure out the rest later." Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself visiting Martin regularly, arranging for his care, consulting with his doctors. He was unfailingly grateful. His gentle manner a stark contrast to his brother's abrasiveness. During one visit, as Martin worked with a physical therapist on regaining movement in his left arm, I noticed a photo on his nightstand. 2 boys, one clearly Gerald, the other Martin, standing beside a stern-looking man. "Your father?" I asked when the therapist had gone. Martin nodded. "Harold Whitman, brilliant businessman. Terrible father." "How so?" Martin's eyes clouded with old pain. "He believed in toughening us up, pitted us against each other, made us compete for everything. His approval, opportunities, even basic affection." He sighed. "Gerald became what our father wanted. Ruthless, driven, willing to sacrifice anything for success. I couldn't, or wouldn't." The parallels were unmistakable. Gerald had recreated his father's methods in his own leadership style, continuing the cycle of pain and competition. That doesn't excuse what Gerald did, I said quietly. No, Martin agreed. Understanding isn't the same as excusing. But Gerald recognized what he'd become at the end. That's why he chose you, someone strong enough to break the pattern. As Martin recovered enough to leave the hospital, I helped arrange for his care at his apartment. During one visit to set up home health services, I discovered a room filled with paintings, landscapes mostly, rendered with surprising sensitivity. You're an artist, I observed, studying a particularly striking sunset over what looked like Maine coastline. Martin stood in the doorway, leaning on his walker. A hobby. Never good enough to make a career of it. Who told you that? They were wrong. The painting before me showed genuine talent, emotion captured in every brushstroke. Gerald, Martin said simply. He funded my dabbling, as he called it, but made it clear it wasn't a real profession. And you believed him? He was the successful one, the one who made something of himself. Martin moved slowly into the room. Besides, it was easier to accept his support than fight him. The realization hit me then. Martin had been another of Gerald's victims, perhaps the first and longest suffering. The company wasn't the only thing Gerald had ruled through fear and control. You should have an exhibition, I said impulsively. Martin looked startled. What? Your work deserves to be seen. I know a gallery owner in Soho who might be interested. No one would care about an old man's paintings, he protested. Let's find out, shall we? That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with Martin Whitman. As he recovered physically, I watched him begin to emerge from his brother's shadow, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The gallery exhibition happened 2 months later. Martin's landscapes and seascapes, created over decades but never shown publicly, filled the small Soho space. To his astonishment, critics were positive, and several pieces sold on opening night. I never thought, he said, looking around at the crowd admiring his work. That's the thing about living under someone else's judgment, I replied. You stop trusting your own worth. As autumn painted Central Park in fiery colors, I found myself spending more time with Martin. Our unlikely friendship had blossomed from obligation into genuine connection. He was nothing like his brother, thoughtful where Gerald had been abrupt, kind where Gerald had been cutting, appreciative where Gerald had been demanding. One crisp October evening, we sat in his apartment looking through old photographs. Martin had been sorting through Gerald's belongings, a process both practical and emotional. I found something you should see, he said, pulling an envelope from a box. It was in Gerald's study safe. Inside was a folder labeled simply, Succession. I opened it to find detailed notes about company employees, assessments of strengths, weaknesses, potential. My name appeared on every page, with observations dating back to my first week. Rachel shows remarkable resilience, one note read. Recovers quickly from setbacks. Maintains quality despite pressure. Another. Defended Chen when I criticized his work publicly. Loyalty without self-interest. Rare. And most surprisingly, pointed out critical flaw in Vantage strategy that I missed. Didn't take credit when proven right. Integrity over ego. I closed the TO folder, emotions tumbling through me, anger at being studied like a specimen, confusion over Gerald's methods, reluctant acknowledgement that he had seen qualities in me I hadn't fully recognized myself. He watched all of us, I said, like we were lab rats in his experiment. Martin nodded sadly. Gerald believed he could understand people by breaking them. It was how our father treated him. The cycle stops here, I said firmly. At DCC, we build people up, not tear them down. Martin smiled. That's exactly why Gerald chose you. He knew you would create what he couldn't. A place where people thrive because they're valued, not feared. As I drove home that night, Manhattan's lights glittering across the bridge, I considered the strange inheritance Gerald Whitman had left me. Not just a company, but a chance to heal the damage he had caused, to transform his legacy from one of fear to one of possibility. The next morning, I called an all-staff meeting. 3 months into our rebranding, DCC was not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. New clients attracted by our collaborative approach, improved employee retention, a workplace where innovation flourished because people felt safe to take risks. We've made tremendous progress, I told the assembled team, but there's something important we haven't addressed. The wounds from the past. A hush fell over the room. Many of you worked under Gerald Whitman for years. You endured criticism that crossed into cruelty, competition that bred distrust, pressure that damaged health and relationships. I paused, meeting the eyes of those who had suffered longest. We've changed our name and our methods, but we haven't acknowledged the trauma that occurred within these walls. Jessica nodded slightly, encouragement in her eyes. Today, we're announcing the launch of the restoration program, I continued. Additional paid leave for those who need time to recover. Mental health services fully covered by our insurance. Flexible work arrangements. And most importantly, a commitment from leadership, from me, that your well-being matters as much as your productivity. The room remained quiet, but I could feel the shift, like a collective exhale. Gerald Whitman believed sacrifice was the price of success. I believe that's false, that our best work comes not from fear of failure, but from confidence that we're valued regardless of outcome. I smiled. We're not just changing how we work, we're changing the definition of success itself. As people filed out after the meeting, David approached me. That was brave, he said, acknowledging the elephant in the room. Should I have done it sooner? He considered this. No. We needed to establish the new normal first, to know this wasn't just talk. Karen joined us, nodding. Agreement. People believe in your leadership now, Rachel. That's why they're ready to address the past. Speaking of addressing the past, Jessica said, approaching with a mischievous glint in her eye. Who's the silver fox I've seen you with around town? Don't think we haven't noticed. I laughed, surprised by the question. Martin Whitman, Gerald's brother. He had a stroke, and I've been helping with his recovery. Just helping? Jessica raised an eyebrow. He's 30 years older than me and only recently stopped needing a walker, I pointed out. So yes, just helping, and friendship. But later that night, as I helped Martin hang a newly framed painting in his living room, I realized something important. In helping him heal from his brother's influence, I was healing too. Each step Martin took toward independence, each painting he created without seeking approval, each decision he made for himself, they were all reminders that Gerald Whitman's power had limits, that damage could be repaired, that new stories could emerge from old pain. You know, Martin said as we stepped back to admire the hanging, Gerald would hate what you've done with the company. I know, I replied. Martin smiled, the most genuine expression I'd seen from him yet. And that's exactly why it's working. 6 months into my leadership at DCC, the company had transformed from a fear-driven pressure cooker into a thriving, collaborative community. Our client list had grown, employee retention was at an all-time high, and we'd been featured in Business Insider as an example of successful corporate culture transformation. But despite our progress, something nagged at me, an unfinished chapter in the story of Gerald Whitman's legacy. The realization came during a rainy Tuesday morning meeting with the executive team. We were reviewing quarterly performance when Jessica made an offhand comment. These numbers are incredible considering what we inherited, she said, flipping through the report. The fact that we're not just stable but growing after the Whitman exodus is nothing short of miraculous. Whitman exodus? I asked. Jessica looked surprised. You know, the clients and senior staff who left when Gerald died. When they realized you wouldn't be continuing his methods. Something in her tone made me pause. You make it sound like they left because they preferred his leadership style. An uncomfortable silence fell over the conference room. Glances were exchanged. Some did, David finally admitted. Not everyone hated working under Whitman. The people who thrived in his system, who learned to navigate it, even exploit it, they were the first to jump ship when you took over. Why wasn't I told this? I asked, looking around the table. Karen shifted in her seat. We didn't want to discourage you, and honestly, good riddance to anyone who preferred his toxic approach. Where did they go? I pressed. More uncomfortable glances. Apex Strategies, Jessica said reluctantly. Victor Mercer's firm. He was Whitman's protege before you came along. Left about 3 years ago to start his own consultancy. Victor Mercer. The name was vaguely familiar. A shark-like man who had departed before I'd had much interaction with him. According to office lore, he'd been one of the few people Gerald Whitman had actually respected. And Whitman's top clients followed our departing staff to Apex, I concluded. David nodded. Some, not all. After the meeting, I sat alone in my office, thinking. We'd been so focused on healing the company from within that we'd ignored the external narrative, the story being told about us in the industry. If Victor Mercer was positioning himself as Gerald Whitman's true successor, carrying on his cutthroat legacy, It could undermine everything we'd built. I called Thomas Reynolds. "What do you know about Victor Mercer and Apex strategies?" I asked when he answered. Reynolds's pause spoke volumes. I was wondering when this would come up. Should it have come up sooner? Perhaps. I could almost see him straightening his tie, a habit when he was choosing his words carefully. Victor Mercer was, in many ways, Gerald's most successful protege. He embraced Gerald's philosophy wholeheartedly, the ruthlessness, the psychological tactics, all of it. And now he's positioning himself as Whitman's rightful heir, I guessed. Yes, Apex has been aggressively targeting your clients, suggesting that DCC has gone soft, that without Whitman's methods, you can't deliver the same results. I felt a surge of anger. But we are delivering. Our numbers prove it. Numbers aren't always what convince people, Rachel. Narratives do. Reynolds paused again. There's something else. The Harrington account. They're considering moving to Apex. My stomach dropped. Harrington Industries was our largest remaining client, one I'd worked particularly hard to retain after Whitman's death. Why wasn't I informed? Because I just found out this morning. Charles Harrington and Victor are having dinner tonight at Le Bernardine to discuss terms. After hanging up, I sat staring at the Manhattan skyline, feeling as though I'd been blindsided. We'd made such progress internally, but externally, the ghost of Gerald Whitman still haunted us, now wearing Victor Mercer's face. I had a choice. Let it go. Focus on our path forward regardless of industry gossip, or confront this challenge directly. That evening, I found myself walking into Le Bernardin, dressed impeccably in a midnight blue suit that projected the quiet confidence I'd worked to embody as a leader. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. I'd hosted client dinners here before, and discreetly pointed toward a corner table where Victor Mercer sat with Charles Harrington. Victor hadn't changed much. Still razor-sharp in his tailored suit, his smile calculating as he leaned toward Harrington. He embodied everything Gerald Whitman had valued: ruthless ambition, wrapped in polished presentation. I approached their table, aware that I was about to either save our largest client or lose him completely. "Charles," I greeted Harrington warmly. What a pleasant surprise. Both men looked up, startled. Harrington recovered first, standing to kiss my cheek. "Rachel, I didn't expect to see you here. I was meeting with another client." I lied smoothly. "Couldn't help noticing you two deep in conversation." Victor Mercer's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Rachel Dawson, Hartwell and Whitman's unlikely heiress, though I hear it's called something else now. Dawson Collaborative Consulting," I confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. "Mind if I join you? Just for a moment?" Without waiting for permission, I sat in the empty chair. A waiter materialized. Instantly. But I waved him away. "Charles," I said, turning to Harrington, "I understand you're considering moving your business to Apex." Harrington had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was going to call you tomorrow to discuss." "It's a straightforward business decision," Victor interrupted. "Apex can provide the same results Harrington experienced under Gerald's leadership. Results that, frankly, have been lacking since his passing." I kept my expression neutral despite the provocation. "Interesting perspective. Our data shows Harrington's market share has increased 4% under our new strategic direction." "Short-term gains," Victor dismissed. "Gerald understood long-term domination requires certain decisive approaches." "You mean fear-based management, arbitrary deadlines, and treating people like disposable resources?" I asked pleasantly. Victor's smile didn't waver. "I mean effectiveness, results, the Whitman way." I turned to Harrington. "Charles, may I ask why you're considering changing firms?" Harrington looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Victor has made some compelling points about maintaining the aggressive edge that Gerald brought to our strategy. "The Whitman method worked," Victor pressed. "Rachel has abandoned it because she lacks the stomach for what true success requires." Something clicked into place for me then. A realization about what was really happening. This wasn't just about business. This was about legacy. Victor Mercer believed he was Gerald Whitman's true heir, carrying forward his philosophy. And in his mind, I had betrayed that legacy. "I didn't abandon the Whitman method," I said quietly. "I evolved beyond it." Victor scoffed. "Pretty words to disguise weakness." "Is it weak to achieve better results while building people up instead of breaking them down?" I asked. "Is it weak to increase client satisfaction while decreasing staff turnover? Is it weak to create sustainable success rather than burning through talent and goodwill?" I leaned forward, my voice low but intense. "Victor, I know you idolize Gerald. You saw his cruelty as strength, his manipulation as strategy. But here's what you missed. Gerald himself recognized at the end that his approach was fundamentally flawed. Victor's composure cracked slightly. That's absurd. Gerald Whitman built an empire on his methods. An empire he left to me, I countered. Not because I embodied his approach, but because I refused to. He spent 5 years testing me, pushing me to my breaking point. And in the end, he chose me precisely because I wouldn't become him. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded paper, a copy of the letter Gerald had left me after his death. I slid it across to Charles Harrington. Gerald's own words, I said. Read it if you like. Harrington hesitated, then picked up the letter. His eyes widened slightly as he read. Victor's face had paled. This proves nothing. It proves everything, I replied. Gerald Whitman built a successful company, yes, but he also built a toxic culture that was unsustainable. He knew it, and he charged me with fixing it. I turned back to Harrington. Charles, you've, worked with us for over a decade. You've seen both approaches. Under Whitman, your account was profitable but plagued with staff turnover, missed deadlines covered up, and communication problems. Under DCC, we've delivered consistent results, transparent reporting, and a stable team that truly understands your business. The growth numbers do speak for themselves, Harrington admitted. Because real leadership isn't about fear or dominance, I said. It's about bringing out the best in people so they can deliver their best work, consistently, sustainably. I stood, smoothing my jacket. Victor is selling you Gerald Whitman's approach without Gerald Whitman's final understanding that it ultimately fails. I placed my card on the table. Call me tomorrow after you've made your decision. Either way, I respect your choice. With that, I walked away, heart pounding but steps steady. I'd said my piece. The rest was up to Harrington. The next morning, my phone rang at precisely 9 a.m. Charles, I answered. Rachel? Harrington's voice was warm. I've decided to remain with DCC. Relief flooded through me. I'm glad to hear that, Charles. That letter was illuminating, he said. I always respected Gerald's results, but his methods made me uncomfortable. I'm glad to know that even he recognized their limitations in the end. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair, processing what had happened. The confrontation with Victor Mercer hadn't just been about saving a client. It had been about confronting the last vestige of Gerald Whitman's influence on my life and leadership. Later that day, I received an unexpected visitor. Martin Whitman knocked gently on my office door, looking healthier than I'd seen him yet. Martin, I greeted him, genuinely pleased. What brings you here? He settled into the chair across from me, moving with only a slight stiffness from his stroke. I heard about what happened with Victor Mercer. News traveled fast in our industry. Word gets around. Victor called me, Martin said, surprising me. He was quite upset. Seemed to think I might share his outrage over how you're dismantling Gerald's legacy. And do you? I asked, curious about his reaction. Martin smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, something that had become more common as he continued to recover not just from his stroke, but from a lifetime in his brother's shadow. Quite the opposite, he said. I told Victor that Gerald would be pleased. Victor didn't believe that, I'm sure. No, because Victor never really understood Gerald. Martin leaned forward, earnestness in his expression. My brother was a deeply flawed man, Rachel. But he wasn't stupid. He recognized his own failures even if he couldn't overcome them. That's why he chose you. Someone. Strong enough to create what he couldn't. I thought about this. About the strange, twisted wisdom in Gerald Whitman's final acts. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still playing out his script, I admitted. If even my rebellion against his methods is somehow part of what he planned. Martin considered this. Does it matter? If the result is positive? If people are thriving rather than suffering? It was a profound question, one I'd been wrestling with since taking over the company. Was I truly free of Gerald Whitman's influence if my leadership was defined, even in opposition, by his? I think, I said slowly, that at some point, the origin of a journey becomes less important than the destination you choose. Martin nodded, approval warming his face. Exactly. Gerald may have set events in motion, but you're the one steering the ship now. The choices are yours. The company is yours. The future is yours. As Martin left, I felt something shift within me, a final release from the weight of Gerald Whitman's legacy. Whether he had manipulated me into this position or genuinely seen something in me worth nurturing in his twisted way, What mattered now were my choices, my vision, my leadership. That afternoon, I called a meeting with Jessica, David, and Karen, the core team who had survived the Whitman years with me and helped build something new from the ashes. I think it's time we made a final break with the past, I told them. Victor Mercer is positioning Apex as the true inheritor of the Whitman method. Let him have it. What do you mean? Jessica asked. I mean, we stop defining ourselves in relation to Gerald Whitman at all, either continuing his work or rejecting it. We simply move forward as ourselves. David nodded slowly. Define the company by what we are, not what we're not. Exactly, I agreed. No more references to the post-Whitman era or recovering from the old culture. From now on, we are simply DCC, a company defined by collaboration, innovation, and respect. As my team nodded their agreement, I felt the last ghost of Gerald Whitman fade from the room. We were free now, not because we had forgotten the past, but because we had learned from it and chosen to build something better. That night, I stood on my apartment balcony, looking out at the city lights. 6 months ago, I had stood at Gerald Whitman's memorial and told a beautiful lie. That lie had changed everything, not because it rewrote the past, but because it had opened a door to a different future. Whatever Gerald Whitman's motivations had been in choosing me as his successor, manipulation, redemption, or something in between, I was grateful for where it had led. Not just to leadership of a thriving company, but to a deeper understanding of what true strength looked like. It wasn't cruelty disguised as high standards. It wasn't fear masked as motivation. It was the courage to believe in people's potential, the wisdom to know that kindness wasn't weakness, the patience to build something sustainable rather than immediately impressive. My phone buzzed with a text from Martin. Art show this weekend. Sold 3 paintings already. Thank you for believing. I smiled, typing back, you always had it in you. Some people just needed to get out of your way. As I sent the message, I realized it applied equally to everyone who had suffered under Gerald Whitman's shadow, myself included. We had always had it in us. We just needed the space to grow. 1 year to the day after Gerald Whitman's death, I stood at the podium in our newly renovated conference room, looking out at the assembled staff of DCC. The room buzzed with energy, not the anxious tension of the Whitman era, but genuine excitement. Today marks not just a year since we began this journey, I said, but the official launch of the DCC Foundation. Applause filled the room. The foundation had been months in the planning, a nonprofit arm dedicated to supporting workplace mental health initiatives and ethical leadership training. With an initial endowment of $5 million, I continued, the foundation will provide resources for companies looking to transform toxic cultures, support for employees recovering from workplace trauma, and scholarships for future business leaders committed to ethical practices. In the front row, Martin Whitman nodded approval. Beside him sat Thomas Reynolds, who had surprised me by becoming one of the foundation's most enthusiastic supporters. This foundation, I explained, represents our commitment to ensuring that the lessons we've learned don't stay within these walls, that the transformation we've experienced becomes a model for others. I paused, considering my next words carefully. I had debated whether to mention Gerald Whitman at all today. We had spent months defining ourselves beyond his shadow, creating an identity that stood on its own. But some stories need proper endings. A year ago, many of us gathered in a very different room to mark the passing of Gerald Whitman, I said, my voice softening. Today, we gather not to remember a man, but to celebrate what we've built together from the challenges we faced. The room was silent. Now, everyone listening intently. There's a concept in Japanese art called kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold, highlighting the breaks rather than hiding them. The result is something stronger and more beautiful than the original. I smiled. That's what we've done here. We've taken what was broken and repaired it with something precious. Our commitment to each other, our belief in a better way. Jessica wiped away a tear, nodding. David's usual reserve had softened into something more vulnerable. Karen beamed with pride. The DCC Foundation ensures that our story becomes more than just our experience. It becomes a resource, a guide, a light for others facing similar challenges. I raised my glass. To turning pain into purpose, to transformation, to all of you who made it possible. To DCC, the room echoed, glasses raised. As people mingled after the formal presentation, Martin approached, walking with only the slightest hint of his former difficulties. Gerald would never have approved of the foundation, he said, his eyes twinkling. Using company profits for something without direct return on investment? I laughed. All the more reason to do it. Martin's expression turned more serious. You've created something remarkable, Rachel. Not just a successful company, but a community. A place where people grow rather than diminish. We all created it, I corrected. Every person who stayed through the transition, who believed change was possible, who brought their whole selves to work when it was finally safe to do so. Thomas Reynolds joined us, champagne in hand. The industry is taking notice, he said. 3 clients have moved from Apex back to DCC in the past month. Victor Mercer is not pleased. Let him have the clients who value results over people, I replied. We've learned there's a market for both excellence and humanity. We don't have to choose. As the celebration continued, I slipped away for a moment of quiet. In my office, I opened my desk drawer and removed Gerald Whitman's letter, the one that had started this journey. I hadn't looked at it in months, having moved beyond needing its validation or explanation. Rachel, if you are holding this, it means you were the only one who understood the greater test. I spent my life building an empire but destroying people. I knew it. I wanted to see if, even after everything, someone could give me dignity I never earned. You did. And for that, this company is yours. Use it better than I ever did. The words still carried the complexity of the man who had written them. Arrogance mingled with regret, manipulation wrapped in truth. Gerald Whitman had recognized his failings without fully transcending them. He had seen in me something he couldn't be, and in his own twisted way, had created the opportunity for transformation. I returned the letter to my drawer. It was part of our history, but no longer the force shaping our future. Back in the conference room, Jessica intercepted me with a glass of champagne. You disappeared. Just needed a moment, I explained, accepting the drink. Jessica studied me. You know, a year ago, I would never have believed we'd be here. When you stood up at that memorial and told those beautiful lies about Whitman, I thought you'd lost your mind. Sometimes I wonder if I had, I admitted. But now I understand, she continued. You weren't just speaking about who he wasn't. You were speaking about who we could become. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but Jessica was right. That eulogy hadn't just been about fictionalizing Gerald Whitman's past. It had been about imagining a different future for all of us. As the celebration wound down, I found myself standing with Martin near the windows overlooking Manhattan. His art career had flourished over the past year. 3 successful exhibitions, recognition in the art world, and most importantly, a newfound confidence in his own vision. I have something for you, he said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a miniature painting, a sunrise over water, light breaking through darkness, rendered with extraordinary skill and feeling. It's beautiful, I said, genuinely moved. I've called it inheritance, Martin explained. Not what's handed down, but what we choose to carry forward. The title resonated deeply. Gerald Whitman had left me a company, but the true inheritance had been the opportunity to create something new, to transform pain into purpose, fear into courage, control into collaboration. Later that evening, as the office emptied and the cleaning crew began their work, I stood alone in the lobby looking at the DCC logo on the wall. A simple, elegant design that represented connection and collaboration. Thomas Reynolds appeared beside me, briefcase in hand. Heading out? He asked. In a minute, I replied, just taking it all in. Reynolds nodded understanding. A year ago, you gave a eulogy that changed everything. You created a beautiful fiction about Gerald Whitman. And now we've created a beautiful reality in spite of him. I finished. Because of you, Reynolds corrected. Your vision, your leadership. He paused. Gerald chose well. As Reynolds left, I remained in the quiet lobby, reflecting on the journey of the past year. From that moment at the podium, telling lies that somehow pointed toward truth, to today, launching a foundation that would extend our transformation beyond our walls. The true measure of leadership, I had learned, wasn't in how much power you wielded over others, but in how much you empowered them to grow. It wasn't about being feared, but being trusted. Not about control, but connection. Gerald Whitman had ruled through fear, believing it was the only way to achieve excellence. I had discovered a different path, one where excellence flowed naturally from people feeling valued, heard, and respected. Outside, New York City glittered in the evening. Light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new growth. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply appreciate how far we had come. From a toxic workplace ruled by a tyrant to a thriving community built on mutual respect. In the end, Gerald Whitman's final lesson had been his most valuable, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in hardening ourselves against the world, but in remaining open to possibility. Not in defending our flaws, but in recognizing them. Not in breaking others to prove our power, but in lifting them to discover theirs. As I finally turned to leave, I thought about that moment 1 year ago. Standing at a podium, surrounded by silence, choosing to tell a story not about who Gerald Whitman had been, but about who we could become. It had been a eulogy not just for a man, but for a way of leading, a way of being that had caused so much pain. And from that ending had come our beginning. Outside, the spring air felt fresh with possibility. I hailed a taxi, ready to head home after a long but fulfilling day. As the car pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of the DCC sign illuminated against the darkening sky, no longer defined by what we had overcome, but by what we were creating together. The true measure of strength, I had learned, isn't in how much power you hold over others, but in how much grace you can show when it's the last thing they deserve. That was Gerald Whitman's final lesson, and our new beginning.